Okay, friends, so if you're interested in our forum, I encourage you to come on forward. We have a lot to cover, so we're going to get started in like 2 minutes. Okay, so we are going to start. And again, if you're here for the forum, we have a whole bunch of open seats up front and some extra chairs that are being put out. Thank you, Ben. So welcome, everyone. Welcome. This is such a busy season in our church, and I know we had a forum last Sunday, and this particular topic was one we planned to address in February, and then we had those snow ice Sundays. So it's good that we're able to gather and talk and share. We're here to talk about the Black Lives Matter banner that has been on the front of the sanctuary for coming up on 5 years. 5 years. And in just a minute, we're going to start with some community guidelines for this conversation. But first, I just thought I would refresh people's memory. If you are newer than 5 years to this church, like myself and Kit, it might help to remember how we actually got here to this point. So I suppose it's worth starting with the fact that George Floyd was murdered on May 25th, 2020. And the next month, in June of 2020, this was after the annual meeting of First Parish, but the June Parish Committee meeting, we had an update from the Anti-Racism Task Force, led by Ken Hurd and Mary Helen Lawrence, and they made a motion to display a Black Lives Matter banner on the front of the church. And this is just a quote from the minutes of the June 2020 Parish Committee meeting. At this year's annual meeting and at the forum hosted by the Anti-Racist Task Force, we posed the question of what could the First Parish of Lincoln do to raise awareness and become part of the solution to purge the cancer of systemic racism that has metastasized throughout our society. We ask 2 questions. When folks look back 20 years from now, how do we want the First Parish to be remembered for what we did in 2020? What actions might we take to make a difference in our community and in our nation? So skipping ahead a little bit, Ken Hurd shared an artistic rendering of the banner and reviewed feedback. people were in favor, although some people were concerned about the politicization of this issue. And there was also something shared, which was a resolution back from 1963 that this church made, a resolution on racial injustice, wherein the First Parish reaffirmed our faith in the ultimate dignity of all people. So that's just a little context in terms of how this banner was actually put up, right? Because a motion was made at that meeting in June of 2020 to purchase and display a Black Lives Matter banner until such time as the church regroups in person. So I think we felt like as a staff and through conversations with the parish committee, it was due time, maybe past time, to have another conversation, right? With us coming up on 5 years since that decision was made by the church. And I also just want to say I think this whole banner, I think, is affected, right, by the context of our current political situation, our administration. We had planned to have this conversation. We'd started talking about it over a year ago too. So I think it was going to happen either way. But if you're like me, you feel like the context of our current administration and decisions we're seeing certainly changes things. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that's how we got here. And maybe the next slide to get into just some gentle guidelines. So because this is it's a deep topic, right? It's a topic that requires, I think, our best selves, our most open, our most tolerant selves. I thought we would just start with this list of community agreements. We share time and space equitably. We lean into discomfort and uncertainty. It's how we grow. So if someone shares something over this next hour that makes us uncomfortable, we are okay with that. We give each other grace, knowing that the work of living our values is hard, that we will all mess up at some point. And we seek first to understand and assume good intent while also acknowledging impact. Assume good intent while also acknowledging impact, holding that balance, right? So if something we say or do causes harm, we commit to working through it and doing better and making that sort of generous assumption to other people as well. So hopefully those are some guidelines that we can hold in mind as we get into this conversation. But let me just share what our hopes are for the next hour in terms of our time. We're going to begin with a quick refresh on the Black Lives Matter movement. Sarah and I are going to talk a little bit about the history. It, of course, didn't start in May of 2020. It goes further back than that, and we're going to get into that a little bit. Then we're going to look at some of the ways, and this is where your voices are going to be invited, look at some of the ways that First Parish has lived out our attempt to be in solidarity with this movement, and then some of the ways that we might have fallen short. And then lastly, we're going to have a chance to reflect on what the banner means to us. I think we're going to start out doing that in small groups, just turning to our neighbor. Maybe we're in support of it staying up. Maybe we want it to come down yesterday. Maybe we have another idea. And that's part of the space that we're making for everyone today. Everybody on board so far? Okay. So let's go to the next slide. And Sarah, is that you or am I still up? Yeah.
What are you following me for? Trayvon Martin, 16 years old. I don't have a gun. Stop shooting. Michael Brown, 18 years old. Mom, I'm going to college. Amadou Diallo, 23 years old. I can't breathe. Eric Garner, 43 years old. I Can't Breathe, Freddie Gray, 25 years old. I Can't Breathe, George Floyd, 46 years old. I wanted to begin with these last words of just 5 of the unarmed black men that were killed by police and by community vigilantes over the course of this grassroots Black Lives Matter movement, that this movement was a response to remind us how we got here. The Black Lives Matter movement is a grassroots movement. It started on couches. It started in streets as community members responded to the grief of yet another black person being killed. I wanted to start with this as a reminder that the Black Lives Matter movement is something that has this deeply rooted history in the movement for civil rights. This is not something that happened in isolation from the ongoing pursuit of justice in this country. This is the ongoing work that started in the civil rights movement, or that continued in the civil rights movement that started well before that. But we heard about it because of a little thing called technology. The ongoing nature of violence against black people, it never stopped in the 60s, it kept going. But something shifted. People started to have cameras in their pockets and were able to record what was going on and share that with the world. And so in 2012, let me go here. The ongoing movement for Black life started to take shape in what is called this grassroots movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin. In 2012, that happened. In 2013, his killer was acquitted. And there was an outpouring of rage, frustration, grief from the black communities. And that poured out into the streets in public protest, in demonstration. And part of the growth of that and the organizing power that happened was as a result of social media. A small group of black women started posting online, "Black people, I love you. Our lives matter. Your life matter. Black lives matter," as a response to this declaration by the state that, in fact, apparently Trayvon Martin's life didn't matter, right? And so they pushed back on that. They dissented from that state-offered opinion by saying, no, black life does matter. And that turned into a hashtag on Twitter that started this outpouring of the ability to organize, that we want to meet together in the streets and talk about this and demonstrate and affirm our dignity, our human dignity, and the fact that while black lives have not mattered historically in this country, we affirm that they actually do, and we are going to keep saying it until society is structured in such a way that it demonstrates that reality, that inherent worth and dignity. The movement continued on in 2014. Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Eric Garner in New York, continued on. Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Emmanuel AME Charlotte, the church that a gunman entered, when the historically black church that a gunman entered and killed a number of black people during and as well including their minister during a Bible study. 2016, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. These are just some of the names. Perhaps you might remember some of these stories. Perhaps you might remember seeing some of these videos. I will say for myself, I watched those videos, and it was a turning point for me personally in my understanding of what it means to be church. I remember, I will never forget, not just the videos of the murders and the aftermath of them, but I will never forget a video of in Baltimore in response to the Freddie Gray's murder, while in police custody, of clergy from across the city of Baltimore coming together and standing in a crossroads in the middle of the street, calling for justice. And I said, that's what the church is supposed to be doing right now. And before we go on, I want to lift up this here in the center is Reverend Tracy Blackman. She's a UCC minister, and she was in the national governing body of the United Church of Christ for a long time, and she's a minister in Ferguson, and so she was quoted by our guest minister last week at the end of his sermon, talking about the need for reformation today. And she said during the Ferguson uprising for justice, praying for freedom, in quoting Frederick Douglass, she said, "Praying for freedom never did me any good till I started praying with my feet. It's time for us to stop waiting on the Lord to do everything and understand that we are the embodiment of Christ on this earth, and we have to not just pray with our mouths, but pray with our actions. It means we need to be on the ground. It means we need to be ministering to those people who are hurting. We need to stop waiting for people to come into our sanctuaries. We need to go out in the streets." This continued in 2017. In Charlottesville, Virginia, there was a gathering of the Black Lives Matter movement in a church where Tracy Blackman was preaching. They were in the church, and they were in that building surrounded by neo-Nazis, Proud Boys, and folks from the far right at the Unite the Right rally, and they were threatened with violence. And in response to that, the next day you see clergy once again marching through the streets, standing on the side of justice, standing with the Black Lives Matter movement. Here we have UCC ministers here and here. Here we have UU ministers here and here. Our denominations, our traditions have been on the front lines of this movement for years and have been participated. This is part of what it means to be church in our lineage. I wanted to include this photo that I took while I was in Palestine last year. It's a mural of George Floyd on the apartheid wall. This Black Lives Matter movement is an international movement, and it's a movement that affirms the dignity of all people, right? So to the statement Black Lives Matter is not an exclusive statement at the expense of all other calls for justice and equity. It is part of the recognition that we are not free until all of us are free. And in order to make all of us free, we have to name when injustices have happened. And so the oppressed people in Palestine bore witness to the injustice, and they have for years, of what's happened to Black folks in the United States, and they respond with expressions of solidarity and unity with all people that have been harmed by state violence. And so I started there just to say this didn't start in 2020. The movement as a grassroots movement took the shape that it has in response to this social media endeavor to respond to ongoing state violence. But we know, perhaps many of us know it most, remember it most well in response to the murder of George Floyd in 2020. But it's been going on, and it has continued. Perhaps the killings of Black people have not been in the news as much, but they have continued, and in fact, they have increased. But what I want to end on here is just a reminder that the Black Lives Matter movement, it is a grassroots movement. Yes, that phrase has been co-opted by official organizations that do not represent the movement as a whole. And that's what I want to kind of hold in tension, is the recognition that perhaps someone might have feelings about a particular organization, but it started as a spiritual, theological, moral claim from the people that have been harmed by this violence. And those folks that have been doing that work for years have pushed back on the organization that they have said they've sullied our good name. We have been for years known as work that we're doing work for justice, and now we have been maligned by a few bad actors. But what I want to bring us back to is that the roots of this phrase, it's a affirmation of human dignity that came from a group of people that have suffered, not just since 2020, but for a long, long time. And it's part of our call as people of faith, as a community of faith, to pray with our feet.
Thanks, Sarah. Really helpful context, I think. So many dates and years to remember back to, and as we think about how a grassroots movement might coalesce around some specific political claims, I wanted to bring us back to August of 2016, and that is when the Movement for Black Lives rolled out what they called a vision for Black Lives. And so they had 6 sort of chief demands, and I just wanted to list these so we can keep them in our heads, because the next thing we're going to do, and this is when we're going to start to hear from all of you, the next thing we're going to do is start to think about the ways that our congregation has been able to respond and, like I said, work and act in solidarity. But these were the demands of the Movement for Black Lives back in 2016. Redirecting resources from prisons and the military to education, health, and safety. Creating a just, democratically controlled economy, and securing black political power within a genuinely inclusive democracy. So as we think about, resources in education, health, and safety, a more just economy, and a more democratic way of being in this country, those were the core demands of the movement. We can do the next slide, I think. And so focusing our attention on the criminal justice system, right? The ways in which policing, we talked about how many of these folks who died at the hands of the police. The way in which the legal system, mass incarceration, if you've read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, that came out in 2010, I think. So this already was a huge problem, and then the movement has lifted it up to us. And then capital punishment, the way in which many states in this country still execute, or some states still execute black people at inordinately high rates. Next slide. So Sarah mentioned this, and I just wanted to mention it once again more clearly. According to data collected by the Washington Post, this is in 2022, police shot and killed at least 1,055 people nationwide last year, the most since the newspaper began tracking fatal shootings, more than the number of shootings that happened in 2020 or 2019. Black people, who account for 13% of our population, accounted for 27% of those fatally shot and killed by police in 2021. So the efforts and the speaking out and the protests, I think, have made a real difference, but the problem, according to these statistics at least, has not gone away. It's only perhaps gotten worse. Next slide, please. I mentioned The New Jim Crow, and I'll also just mention the fact that now we have 20 to 30 folks in our church going to the prison in Shirley, right, and building relationships with prisoners of different races. But I know for me, at least, that's been an incredible window into this reality, right? You can read a book and learn about statistics, but when you actually get to know someone who's living under the conditions of mass incarceration, it makes it real in a different way. Next slide, please. I think this is the last slide before we're going to open it up a little bit, but I wanted to just give you this definition of racism for us to think about. I think, the first 20 years of my life or so, I thought about racism in very sort of personal, emotional terms, which is important, right? But Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a prison abolitionist and geographer and academic, challenges us to think about it in a more systemic way. She argues that racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. To premature death. So when we think about terms like white supremacy, and honestly like racism in this country, we're not just talking about our inner feelings. We're not just talking about the work we do on an individual level, though that's very important. We're talking about power and structures and the impact of power on people's lives. On people's lives. Okay, next slide, please. So, keeping all that in mind, right? Keeping in mind the context of this movement and keeping in mind some of the demands that the movement for Black Lives has lifted up, I thought it'd be interesting for us to just start our reflection today by thinking about some of the things we've done. And there have been a number of things that I'm really proud of as a church. And I have a list here, but I wanted to hear some of them from you all. What are some of the ways, as you think back over the last 5 years, that we have responded to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Thanks, Nate. Barbara Slater. And I would just comment on one of the things that I was most particularly involved with, although I've been involved with many. But first, the task force that you mentioned did become a permanent committee. And so the racial justice advocates have been involved. But one of the things that I was especially involved in the spring of 2022 was an effort to look at issues around racism in the Boston area. And to that end, we had about 5 or 6 different speakers who came who had special knowledge about Boston. For instance, Dr. Thea James, who is a black physician at Boston City Hospital, talked to us about the differences between the health in the black community that is within a mile, one direction in our hospital, from our hospital, and the white community in another. Just a small example. We had someone by the name of Glenn Lloyd, who was part of the business community, working on, a black leader, working on wealth creation within the black community in Boston. We had Stacy Rubin, who came from the Conservation Law Foundation, who talked about transportation in Boston and linking environmental justice with racial justice and which groups within the Boston area were disenfranchised, I guess a way to put it, around transportation. Who else? Anyway, you get the idea. We were working really hard to understand race in Boston area. Oh, and in particular, we had a woman who grew up in Concord by the name of Geisner, who's a historian in California. And she had done her research on Route 128 and the way that technology and the development of Route 28 furthered segregation in this community. She was very effective, and she spoke to about 200 of us, I think, or pretty close anyway. That's just one illustration, but at the same time, we were doing a lot around reading books, and we did just a whole lot of different things.
Yes, that task force, which became the Racial Justice Advocates, has been such a helpful guide for us in so many ways.
Thanks. We created the Racial Justice Journey, which had 3 modules. The first was history, and the second was what Barbara talked about, was issues, and the third was action, and action includes a lot of things. When Kit came, she told us that action also meant educating ourselves. So that hadn't occurred to us, but that we have done that. So in the first module, we had history, and I think a lot of us were stunned that we had never been taught anything about Black history. So every Thursday was Racial Justice History Night. So we all came on Zoom because it was still during COVID. And I think the things that we learned were astounding. And it just hit me so strongly that Black history is American history, and we have no history without looking at the contributions of Blacks throughout it, from when they were enslaved and they built Washington, and they've done so much all through it. We had a lot of videos that just brought it all home to us. None of us knew about Reconstruction. I mean, Reconstruction, we were taught, was when the poor South had to suddenly have carpetbaggers. And when we learned the real truth about Reconstruction, we were all absolutely dumbfounded. And I can't tell you how many people came up and said, we didn't know any of this. And Mary Gaylord and I chaired this, and it was so moving to me. And then we went to issues, and that was so moving to me. And now we are doing everything that we can together.
I hate this to sound like a pile-on, but I also really appreciated merging some of our studies and our thinking about education and how important a journey that is. And we looked at the issues of housing, and we were facing some of those same issues here in Lincoln and the greater Boston area and across the country. The great need for housing, especially as income inequality and wealth disparity just continues to grow. But to be able to look at and think about the history of that housing, housing segregation. I love this morning's sermon where we talked about, where we listened and thought about, we're shaped by the decisions that we make and the decisions to place covenants, especially those that exclude a particular kind of person, or their skin color, their heritage, their religion, and reminded, or I never knew, that the very first covenant in the country was in Brookline, Massachusetts, to exclude those of Irish descent and people of color. But nevertheless, I just think education is an incredibly important element. That is a form of advocacy, and I feel really that a lot of this has been a deep inward journey for all of us, and in conversation with each other, which is just one of the best things, to be able to actually have these conversations with each other.
I would like my husband to come out and tell a wonderful story, but this was before 5 years. It's beyond years ago. Gus. Where are you, Gus? Tell
Yeah, I mean, how many of you have heard me blather on about the First Parish's involvement in the march in Selma? Okay, you've heard the story. Okay, how many of you have not heard my story about the First Parish Church? Okay, just a couple, I'll make it fast. Charlie Styron, our minister at the time, was friends with someone who was going down. And so Charlie decided he wanted to go, and he took with him a couple of Lincoln people who went down, including Al Levin, who was very proud of the fact that he actually made it on Nixon's enemies list. Proud of many things. He was also had been struck by polio as an adult and was in a wheelchair, and he went to Selma to march. And Ken Bergen, one of the patriarchs of the church, a downtown lawyer, got a phone call, and it was Charlie Styron, and he said, we're in jail. And Ken said, I'm not surprised. And Charlie Styron said, we need to make bail. And Styron said, and Bergen said, okay, how much? And he said, well, it's $100 a person. So Ken is thinking, 3 people, $100 each, we're all set. And he said, no, we'll find a way to wire you the $300. And Reverend Styron said, no, you don't understand. There's 100 of us in here. And Ken Bergen did it and came up with the money in one night from Lincoln. And that's like $10,000. It's a lot of money. And, in those days, that was a lot of money, especially. And he just came up with it. People committed to it. Bail was made, and everybody else was out. So, you vote with your feet, and you vote with your wallets, and that's kind of where Lincoln was, 50 years ago.
So great to hear.
Elliot Graybill, isn't that his name, was there too, and Elliot Hubbard. And every year on the flowers on Martin Luther King Day, we're commemorating that trip, and it was given by Elliot and his wife. And that meant so much to me because it brought it home.
These are great memories to hear. Maybe if we have other examples of how we've responded that we're proud of, let's just shout them out because I want to move us ahead. We still have a lot of work to do in this forum. Shout it out, Miranda. I think I know what you might say. The Spiritual Royalties Fund that we started just this fall. We've already raised, I think, over $2,000, maybe $3,000, $5,000 for the Hamilton Garrett School of Music. The trips to the UUM in Roxbury, yes.
And then I'd love to lift up our MECO program here where we can work directly in our own community and make a difference for these kids and families who are strangers coming into our community. The MECO program was supposed to be a Band-Aid until the urban schools were improved. They still haven't been improved. And it meant so much to the families to come at Christmas time and to just be warmly welcomed. No agenda, but just to be welcomed. And then, of course, going into the schools and being with the children. One-on-one, it's true integration. And we just need like 7 or 8 people who are volunteer to go in maybe 5 times a year. It's not a big group of people, but it shows that we care about listening to them, talking to them, and having fun together.
Thank you. And then the last one that's on my mind, as I mentioned, is the Partakers Prison Mentoring, where we have now over 20 people who are regularly visiting inmate students in the Shirley Prison. Next slide. And we're going to do this one really quick. And so if there's anything that that's come to mind here, I'd love to hear about ways we might have fallen short as we think back to those core themes of the movement, pieces maybe that we have yet to address. And then as we move into our sharing time, that's also something we can talk about then. But I'm just curious, has anything come to mind?
Well, we haven't fixed the problem. We have good intentions. We do what we can, but the problem's still there.
Absolutely true.
I don't think we've fallen short, but I think there is, as Ben said, work still to be done. I would like to see more of us heading into Boston and experiencing the urban ministry and the work they're doing in Roxbury, to be present as volunteers in that community. But I don't feel we've fallen short. I just think there's more work to be done.
Thank you, Alice. That's a great way to put it.
Thank you. I just wanted to riff off of Alice. I subscribe to the Huntington Theater, and there's a wonderful series going on now, Don't Eat the Mangoes, and I mean all about African Americans, the experience here. I think there's so much in Greater Boston that goes on in the arts specifically that goes unattended, unseen, unheard, that we could probably all as a group do a better effort of supporting.
Yes. So look out for a possible trip to the MFA in May, just along those lines, Jane.
Yeah. What amazes me is how much forces against these efforts develops. The more we get involved, the more these forces are getting stronger and more toxic. I couldn't believe that in Washington D.C. they just decided to take away the mural for Black Lives Matter as a result of pressure from the White House, and one of the representatives in the Congress wanted to come up with a bill to force Washington D.C. to take that mural, or they'll lose all the federal funding or something like that. So it's just amazing to me how strong the forces against this are becoming. Another interesting development is how we talked about education. Someone mentioned about education. And yet, in the national level, there's efforts to cancel educational department. So where will we have the nationwide standard to educate people about the true history or true things that are happening? This will be left for each state maybe to decide. And if we find some of this disenfranchisement happening in one of the most liberal states in the country, can you imagine how much will be happening in some of the states which are less sensitive? So it's not we are falling short, but we just should be prepared to more efforts against what we are trying to do.
Thank you so much for that, Edwin. Let's hear from Jennifer and then Ken, and then maybe we will transition to the next part.
Maybe this is, my name's Jennifer Safran. I got interested in this area primarily through my daughter, who works for the Office of the Public Advocate, Jumaane Williams. She's a senior policy analyst. She writes papers on the criminal justice system in New York City. She was very instrumental in the legislation that ended supposedly solitary at Rikers, because it was no surprise, it's not the white people who get in there, okay? And other bills. So she informs me of stuff. So maybe I'm jumping ahead, but one thing about churches I've always noticed is that I think it's important, of course, we have that one-on-one correspondence with real people, but it doesn't change the system. What I'm learning from her, and if you all haven't heard of Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative, okay, he claims, his whole thing is if you don't change the legal system, there's no change. Because like you just said, the forces to keep things the way they are greater. And so perhaps as a church, and the Unitarians have a long history of this, we need to focus more on changing the legal situation, or keep maintaining what was working, but now is threatened to be torn down. Okay.
Thanks, Jennifer. Ken, quickly to you.
This isn't so much a comment about falling short, but many of us in the racial justice advocates went in to visit the Embrace Boston Memorial that was put on the Boston Common. Thanks a lot to Pam and the efforts of her efforts at the Boston Foundation to help get the Embrace Boston organization off the ground. I would love to see us, if we had the wherewithal, to somehow make a contribution annually to Embrace Boston. It's getting harder and harder to raise funds given the license that the Trump administration has given for people to back away from supporting this effort.
So these are all such great suggestions and motivations for us going forward. And I really like what Alice said about celebrating what we've done and then recognizing how much work there still is to do, especially given the conditions that we're facing with our political climate and our elected leaders right now. It brings this into sharper focus, I think, than ever. So, how much time do we have left? Let's say we have 10 or 15 minutes left. We're right on schedule, and so we want to continue to hear from you all. And Sarah's going to lead us into some more reflecting.
So we want to take a few moments to invite you to first, on your own, and then turning to your neighbor, reflect on the banner that we have posted. That's part of our response, right, to the Black Lives Matter movement. What does it mean to you personally? What does it mean to us as a community to display that affirmation? What are we saying about who we are? What do you hope it says about us? And what comes up for you when you think about that banner living on our building? And so I have some paper. I'm going to invite you to think to yourself first and perhaps write down some reflections if you would like to, and then turn to your neighbor and share that with each other. And then we will turn back together as a group and collectively share what has come up for us in this reflection time. So I have paper, and raise your hand if you need something to write with.
Yeah, we just had a great question from Barbara. This is mostly to generate your own thoughts, but also if you're someone like me who sometimes it's a little easier to just write, you're welcome to actually turn this into us at the end, but no requirement on that end. But if you're someone for whom it's a little easier to write and just hand something in, you're welcome to, as a way of making your opinion known.
If you haven't already been doing so, I invite you to turn to your neighbor and share some of your reflections. If you have been, continue doing so. Let's give it another minute or so together in small groups, and then we'll turn back together and share what's come up. Okay. Let's come back together. I'd love to hear what's come up in these fruitful conversations. Okay, I'd love to hear what's come up in these fruitful conversations. Would anyone like to share something that you reflected on individually or with your group? Raise your hand and I'll bring the mic. Okay, I see hands and I'll come to you.
I just remembered that during the time that Nancy Rockwell was here as a minister, a big discussion came up about the name of calling this sanctuary the White Church. And that was a real problem. And we even talked about painting it gray. And people looked into it historically to think, does that work historically in the historic district? So just that we've been struggling with this for a long time, and we're still wondering, what do we call our church? The one down the hill, where the sanctuary? Because we all don't want to call it the White Church.
And Barbara, that's such a great point to raise. I think there isn't a bylaw that now suggests that we call it the sanctuary as a result of that conversation. Yeah.
Winter snow.
Paula.
Paula Waterman. I think what I've been wondering regularly in the last year is, because action has been one of the questions that's come up. How do we act? How do we act with our feet, with our voice? And I will say that in the last week, there's been a wonderful example of sort of the 1960s protest in the House of Representatives, which just cheered my heart enormously. So how do we, I want to have a way to protest what's going on. The biggest, the big black thing that's in the country at the moment. So I'd like to know more about protesting, especially for elders.
But everybody. This is not the first time I've heard it just today, of people saying, how can we protest and how can we get involved in resistance? Great questions, and we will come back to this because there are ways that we can perhaps organize together collectively as a community to share where things are happening and how we can get involved. So come back to that. What else? Reflecting on our banner, what it means to us individually, to our community. I see
Jane had one back here.
When I was truly brand new in 2018 maybe, and I was part of the then membership, and it's now welcoming again, I guess, committee. Two different things came, the Black Lives Matter and the Rainbow Chairs, and they happened as a result of us starting an email and requesting, and I think it's unfortunate that there wasn't a bigger buy-in. There wasn't an opportunity for more of a discussion for both those things, because I do think, even though of course I support both, that there are feelings about both of those things, and I'm sure many others, that really deserve to be heard and understood, and not judged as other or cruel, but to understand what's underneath them, and because I think as a church, that, as I understand it, is really the heart of the matter, is making room at the table for everybody, especially when we don't agree, is to create that safe space for the other. So anyway, that was, thank you, Jane.
Well, I think at this point in time, you know, when this is so much under attack, I think it's really important for our banner to be there. But it's heart-wrenching how this has been co-opted, and I think there was. I mean, it's been associated with the defund the police, and you can understand where the defund the police came from, but it's such an easy thing to attack, and so it's taken on. It twisted it's from its original meaning. I think it still needs to be there, but that's kind of sad.
Thank you. I see Miranda in the back, and then Ben.
Thanks. We were just talking in our little trio here about possibly changing the banner. Well, I don't know if this is accurate, but saying something like resist or resist racism in all forms or something like that, because it's now clearly more than just Black Lives Matter. It's people of all ethnicities who are not pure white, that are under attack in the country. And that could be sort of an update and addition to the banner, and something about activism like resist. Just an idea, but.
Thank you.
We love ideas. Thank you. Thank you.
Any final thoughts as we start to wrap up? I see. 1, 2, 3. Let's go with Judy, and then we'll come back to you.
So I think that the sign has sort of become a part of the church, and that's great. And so I feel like pulling it down might be hard for some of us, but I do feel like it's not, to what Miranda's saying, it's not addressing everything. So if there was a way to add something somehow, or to have, I know that some churches have signs that change, over time. So, there's so many other disenfranchised groups also. So that's sort of my feeling, and that people might not see what's there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hearing a reflection on this is a core value that is very much still prevalent in the community, and it doesn't represent the full breadth of all of the important issues that we as a community care about and want to express our support for and collectively organize for. I see Larry, and then Joan, and then Pam.
Suppose there were a banner update contest, a refresh, picking up on Miranda and Judy, to reflect it today and to make the banner, whatever it would be, less like a default.
I feel that the banner is a public statement of our call to ministry, affirm each person's dignity, and that's really important to me. And I think, if we were to take it down, I would like to make sure we leave something in about racism, because I feel white people have changed and moved away from the black causes for so long. I think about the suffragists, who the blacks were part of it, and then they weren't because it wasn't politically expedient. But when I see this sign at our church or any other church, I feel like I'm at home. These are my people. So when I see that, so it's very important. I mean, I think when the Metco people came here, they felt at home, and I think part of it is probably our sign.
Thank you, Joan. Pam, and then Paula.
I'm the third voice, but yes, I loved the suggestion that we think about. Language is so fabulous, and I bristle a little bit at the idea of resist because it's negative, but absolutely activating. So, I'm torn, but I love the idea. We've got so many great language people in our community, so ditto.
I think we are wrapping up. Just a few more comments. Paula?
I'm going to dare to suggest that is there a possibility with all of these great language people and visual designers that we have in this community that we could actually add a second banner in some form to the landscape? somewhere, so that the banner Black Lives Matter can stay where it is and be the symbol that it is for most of us, I think, but be more inclusive by adding something else.
Yeah, great thought.
Very quick. If we take the banner down now at this time, it will be spun as a backing down by the people that framed our opposition to it as, blacklivesmatter.net is a bad organization, not seeing the larger picture that Sarah laid out.
Thank you, Ben. I see one more hand, and I know there's so much to say about this, and so we will continue, but
I'm just going to lift us out from the banner to encourage us not to get too bogged down on the banner words, such that we forget why we're doing it, right? So let's keep our hearts focused on becoming all we want to be and creating justice in the world.
Real quick piece of information. Having grown up with this being called the White Church, there is a photograph. There is a photograph, black and white, film before color, that shows that building as having been painted what looks like chocolate brown. Not advocating that. I'm just saying that it hasn't always been white.
Good information to have.
Wow, so much to think about. We are at 10 of, and I love the way our conversation covered so much and then brought us to some really interesting ideas, right? And so if you're wondering about next steps, I think the idea is that the ministers will think about everything you've said, and please, if you feel like your voice hasn't been heard and you want to hand us what you wrote down or just send us an email, that would be really great too, especially if you feel like your perspective has not been represented yet. But in terms of next steps, our idea is that we will try to convene a task force, my favorite phrase, a task force made up from the deacons and the parish committee to help us continue to think about what next steps might occur. And Sarah had a really wonderful sort of final word to leave us with.
2 final words. If you are wanting to get connected with ways to organize together as a congregation and you're not already signed up for the Pursuing Justice monthly social action newsletter that First Parish puts out, it's the outreach, racial justice, and all social action oriented news of the First Parish. I curate also some advocacy and activism opportunities every month for us to take a look at and consider. So sign up for that on the website. Just go to the newsletter sign up form and make sure you select all the newsletters that you want to be signed up for, including Pursuing Justice. And so some final words that came to mind as we were reflecting on thinking about this, navigating what is there left to do, right? And reflecting on the ongoing nature. From a rabbinical commentary on the Talmud. Do justice now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Amen.
Thank you, everyone, so much.